Imagine being told that during World War II, American soldiers and German soldiers once fought side by side. Not during a truce, not after the war, right in the middle of a battle. It sounds impossible because for years these men had been trying to kill each other. Yet in the final days of the Second World War, they found themselves standing behind the same walls, aiming their rifles at the same enemy. It wasn't because they suddenly became friends. It wasn't because the war had ended. It was because something even more dangerous was coming. This is the incredible true story of the Battle of Castle Itter, often called the strangest battle of World War II. To understand how such an impossible alliance happened, we have to go back to the final week of the war in Europe. By early May 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing at an astonishing speed. Adolf Hitler was dead, Berlin was surrounded, entire German divisions were surrendering without a fight, while thousands of exhausted soldiers simply abandoned their positions and tried to make it home alive. To most people, the war seemed all but over, but not everyone accepted defeat. Across Austria and southern Germany, fanatical Waffen-SS units refused to surrender. They continued fighting anyone they considered an enemy, and they believed dying was better than giving up. That decision would soon place dozens of innocent people in terrible danger. Hidden among the mountains of Austria stood Castle Itter, a medieval fortress that looked more like something from a fairy tale than a prison. Thick stone walls, high towers, and breathtaking views surrounded the castle, making it seem peaceful from a distance. But behind those walls were some of France's most important prisoners, former prime ministers, famous generals, respected politicians, members of influential families, even one of the country's greatest tennis champions, had all been imprisoned there by the Nazis. Unlike ordinary prisoners of war, these people were considered valuable hostages. They represented influence, power, and bargaining chips that Hitler hoped might still be useful. But as Germany collapsed, the officers responsible for guarding the castle slowly disappeared. Some fled. Others deserted. Communications with Berlin stopped completely. Nobody knew who was giving orders anymore. The prisoners suddenly found themselves trapped in a fortress with almost no guards, but they also knew freedom was still far away. Outside the castle, armed SS patrols were moving through the countryside, hunting for deserters, resistance fighters, and anyone they believed had betrayed the Reich. Rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. If the Waffen-SS reached Castle Itter before the Americans did, they would almost certainly execute everyone inside rather than allow these high-profile captives to be rescued. Waiting quietly was no longer an option. They had to do something before it was too late, so the prisoners made a desperate plan. One volunteer managed to slip out of the castle and disappear into the surrounding forests. Every step was dangerous. German patrols were everywhere. Roads were filled with retreating soldiers, and nobody could be trusted. After hours of moving through villages and back roads, the escapee finally found someone willing to listen. But the man who received the message wasn't an American commander. He wasn't even an Allied soldier. He was Major Josef Gangl, an officer in the German Wehrmacht. Just days earlier, Gangl had been fighting for Nazi Germany like millions of other German soldiers. But by May 1945, he had seen enough. He knew the war was lost. More importantly, he knew that continuing to obey the collapsing Nazi regime would only lead to pointless deaths. Instead of blindly following orders, Gangl made an extraordinary decision. He secretly began cooperating with the Austrian resistance, using his remaining soldiers not to defend the Third Reich, but to protect local civilians from fanatical SS units that still terrorized the region. It was an act of open defiance that could have cost him his life if discovered. When news reached him about the prisoners trapped inside Castle Itter, Gangl immediately understood what was at stake. Those people didn't have days to wait. They might not even have hours, but there was one problem he couldn't solve alone. He had only a handful of loyal men left, nowhere near enough to defend a castle against a determined SS attack. If he wanted any chance of saving the prisoners, he would have to ask for help from the very people he had been fighting only days before. Somewhere nearby, American forces were advancing through Austria. Finding them would be difficult. Convincing them to trust a German officer might be impossible. Yet that impossible meeting meeting was about to create one of the most unlikely alliances in military history, proving that sometimes the line between enemy and ally can change in a single moment. After making his decision, Josef Gangl wasted no time. Every minute mattered. Somewhere inside Castle Itter, dozens of prisoners were waiting for help they weren't even sure would come. Gangl gathered the few soldiers who still trusted him. There weren't many. Most German units in the area had already surrendered, scattered, or simply disappeared. The men standing beside him knew exactly what they were risking. If the Waffen-SS caught them helping the enemy, they would almost certainly be executed as traitors. But by now, none of them believed they were fighting for Germany anymore. They believed they were trying to save innocent lives. The next step was even more dangerous. Gangl had to find the Americans, not by waving a white flag from a distance, but by walking directly toward an army that had spent years treating every German uniform as the enemy. Somewhere near the town of Wrgl, American forces from the 12th Armored Division were moving through the region, clearing the last pockets of resistance. Among them was Captain John Jack Lee Jr., a tank commander with a reputation for making bold decisions. When word reached him that a German major wanted to speak with him, he was understandably suspicious. A trap was always possible. German soldiers pretending to surrender had launched surprise attacks before. There was no reason to believe this situation was any different. But instead of opening fire, Lee agreed to meet Gangl. What followed must have been one of the strangest conversations of the entire war. One officer wore the uniform of the United States Army, the other still wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht. Only days earlier they would have tried to kill each other without hesitation. Now they stood face to face discussing how to save French prisoners from the Waffen-SS. Gangl explained everything: the castle, the prisoners, the SS units moving through the area, the lack of time. Lee listened carefully. The situation sounded almost unbelievable, but every minute they spent debating meant the prisoners remained in danger. Lee made a decision that many officers might never have made. He agreed to help. There was only one problem. He didn't have a large force either. Most American units had already pushed deeper into Austria, leaving only a limited number of men nearby. Instead of waiting for reinforcements that might arrive too late, Lee chose to move immediately with whatever he had. It was a gamble. The rescue force would consist of just a handful of American soldiers, Gangl's remaining German troops, and a single Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny. For a mission that could end in a major firefight, it was an incredibly small force. But speed was now more valuable than numbers. Early the next morning, the strange convoy began moving toward Castle Itter. Local villagers watched in disbelief. American vehicles rolled down the road while German soldiers marched beside them carrying their rifles. Just days earlier, this sight would have been unimaginable. Nobody spoke very much. The Americans still didn't completely trust the Germans. The Germans knew the Americans had every reason to remain cautious, but both groups shared the same destination and the same objective. As they climbed into the mountains, everyone understood that once they reached the castle, there would be no easy way back. When they finally arrived, the prisoners could hardly believe what they were seeing. American soldiers had come to rescue them, but standing beside them were German soldiers wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. At first, there was confusion, then relief, finally cautious optimism. The defenders quickly inspected the castle's walls, towers, windows, and entrances. The fortress was strong, but it had never been designed to withstand a modern battle. Ammunition was limited. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Food wasn't the problem. Time was. Every hour increased the chance that nearby SS units would discover what was happening. The defenders placed the Sherman tank outside the main gate, hoping its cannon alone might discourage an attack. American soldiers took up firing positions beside German riflemen. Orders were exchanged in 2 different languages. Maps were spread across old wooden tables that had probably never been used to plan a battle like this before. Meanwhile, reports from local resistance fighters painted an increasingly grim picture. A large Waffen-SS force had learned about the prisoners and was moving toward Castle Itter. Nobody knew exactly how many men were coming. Some estimated 50, others believed there were well over 100. Either way, the defenders were badly outnumbered. Retreat was still possible. Lee could have withdrawn his men before the fighting started. Gangl could have disappeared. into the mountains and waited for the war to end. Instead, neither man moved. They stayed. They knew exactly what would happen if they left. The prisoners would be executed, and one of the last acts of the collapsing Third Reich would become another massacre. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, an uneasy silence settled over Castle Itter. Rifles were loaded one final time. Machine gun positions were checked. Windows overlooking the narrow mountain road became firing points. Every man inside the castle understood that by morning they would probably be fighting for their lives, and somewhere beyond those hills, the Waffen-SS was already on the move. The attack began shortly after sunrise. At first, only a few rifle shots echoed through the mountains. Then came bursts of machine gun fire. Within minutes, Castle Itter was under full assault. Waffen-SS troops advanced from several directions, using trees and stone walls for cover as they closed in on the fortress. Inside, the defenders responded immediately. American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops, and several of the French prisoners helped defend the castle. It was a sight nobody could have imagined only days earlier. Men who had once been enemies were now risking their lives to protect one another. The Sherman tank Besotten Jenny, positioned outside the main gate, fired several rounds down the narrow road, forcing the first wave of attackers to pull back. For a brief moment, it looked as though the tiny garrison might actually survive. But the SS quickly adapted. Heavy weapons were brought forward, and concentrated fire disabled the Sherman tank, leaving the defenders without their strongest weapon. The burning vehicle became little more than cover at the castle entrance. The battle grew even more intense. Bullets shattered windows, stone walls splintered under constant fire, and ammunition disappeared faster than anyone had expected. Every magazine mattered. Every shot had to count. Everyone inside the castle understood exactly what would happen if the Waffen-SS broke through. Surrender was never an option. As the fighting continued, another serious problem appeared. The castle's radio could no longer maintain reliable contact with nearby American forces. Without reinforcements, the defenders knew they were only delaying the inevitable. Then one man volunteered for a mission that seemed almost impossible. Former French tennis champion Jean Borotra climbed over the castle wall completely unarmed and sprinted through enemy lines toward the surrounding forest. His goal was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Find American troops before the defenders ran out of time. Nobody inside the castle knew if he would survive. All they could do was keep fighting and hope help was on its way. The SS continued tightening its grip around the fortress. Several defenders were wounded and ammunition supplies dropped to critical levels. Every passing minute made the situation worse. Then came the battle's most tragic moment. Josef Gangl noticed former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud standing too close to a window. Without a second thought, Gangl rushed forward and pushed him out of the sniper's line of fire. At that exact moment, a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet struck Gangl in the neck, killing him almost instantly. The German officer who had turned against the Nazi regime sacrificed his own life to save another man's. His death shocked everyone inside the castle, yet nobody abandoned their position. American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops continued fighting side by side, determined to hold the castle for just a little longer. Then, after hours that must have felt like an eternity, the sound they had been hoping to hear finally echoed through the valley. Engines, tanks, American reinforcements were approaching. Jean Borotra had succeeded. Soldiers from the 142nd Infantry Regiment attacked the Waffen-SS from behind, completely changing the course of the battle. Caught between the defenders inside the castle and the newly arrived American force, the SS assault quickly collapsed. The remaining SS troops either surrendered or retreated into the mountains, and before long the battle was over. The prisoners inside Castle Itter were finally safe. Although the fighting lasted only a few hours, its legacy has endured for generations. The Battle of Castle Itter remains the only known battle in which American troops and German Wehrmacht soldiers fought together against the Waffen-SS. Josef Gangl was later honored as one of Austria's national heroes for his courage, while Captain John Jack Lee Jr. received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. For decades, however, this extraordinary battle remained largely forgotten, overshadowed by the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Yet its story deserves to be remembered. In a war defined by hatred, destruction, and unimaginable loss, a handful of ordinary men proved that courage sometimes meant standing beside yesterday's enemy to stop a greater evil. History often celebrates the largest battles and the greatest victories, but sometimes Its most unforgettable story is found inside a single castle, where the most unlikely alliance of World War II became reality.